there, it is I, Cassandra, the vintage arcade gal. Cassandra, where the heck have you been? You're not really making a lot of videos anymore. Well, just grad school, work, holidays, stress, life. Look, I am not under any sort of inspiration to be an influencer, whatever the heck that means. I just make my little videos. Thank you so much for watching. I seem to have a small but very loyal following with these videos. And I try to make time for my hobby when I can. As you can see, I have various projects that are kind of a mess on my workbench here. And I am working on like a big project, which is this book that you may have read on my website about what I'm doing. And I may have some big announcements about it in the next couple of months as we roll into kind of a rough draft and major editing situation and what the future of that project will be. But despite that, we do have a new game in the collection right now, which is Stunt Cycle, which is a super cool game, a game I've wanted for a long time. It's a mid-70s Bronze Age game from Atari, a black and white game, pretty rudimentary as far as technology, considering it's such an early game, and a game that's kind of forgotten about, I think, because like a lot of collectors, they think about like games like Pac-Man or Galaga, like the real hardcore classics. And some of those black and white Bronze Age games, they tend to get forgotten about, which is a shame because they're super interesting and they're historically very important. And Stunt Cycle, I don't think a lot of people know about Stunt Cycle who may even be into classic games. It's not a game you see very often in the modern lexicon when they talk about classic games. So let's first talk about where Stunt Cycle came from and what the inspiration for Stunt Cycle was. And then we'll take a look at the game itself.
Stunt Cycle was released in January of 1976 and in some ways represented a crossroads of gameplay ideas and technology during the middle of what many collectors term the Bronze Age of arcade games. The Bronze Age starts in 1972 with the releases of Nutting's Computer Space and Atari's Pong, but there's some casual disagreement around when the Bronze Age ends and what they call the Golden Age of arcade games starts. Now, I consider the introduction of Space Invaders around 1978 to be the ending point of the Bronze Age as games started to get into more sophistication and home gaming systems started becoming more commonplace. In 1976, arcade games started to make a jump from simple Pong copies or variations of Pong to slightly more sophisticated theming and gameplay concepts. A lot of this was helped by creative designers and the availability of better technology. Around 1976, we also start seeing the first games with microprocessors, which enabled better animation and more complex gameplay. But Atari had not made the microprocessor jump yet with Stunt Cycle, if you'll pardon the pun. Stunt Cycle from a technological standpoint still shares a lot of the basic circuitry with other early arcade games such as Pong, with a PCB mostly made up of IC gates and a lack of a microprocessor. Where it differs are the inclusion of slightly more sophisticated ICs and the addition of a legitimate ROM, which enables sprite-like graphic images and animations. By 1976, Atari had started to break away a bit from the standard Pong formula that had dominated early video arcade games by producing games like the combat-inspired Tank, the racing game series such as Track 10 or the Indy series, and even a game called Shark Jaws, which was unofficially based on the Jaws motion picture and book. So let's talk a moment about the inspiration for the theming of Stunt Cycle, which might seem pretty obvious to those of us of a certain age, and maybe not so obvious to slightly younger video game fans, or at least fans that are younger than I am. Stunt Cycle was an attempt to cash in on the likeness and popularity of celebrity stuntman Evel Knievel. Evel was actually born Robert Craig Knievel in 1938 in Butte, Montana. Knievel out of high school first worked as a miner, but his obsession with motorbikes would motivate him to pursue a career in stunt work. He would start his own touring stunts show based around motorcycles starting in 1966 and soon became a staple presence with television appearances and as a feature during special sporting events. His jumps and stunts became more outlandish and extravagant as he entered and progressed through the 1970s, fueled by his bigger-than-life personality and his trademark red, white, and blue outfit. For those of us who grew up in the 1970s, Evel Knievel was a pop culture staple during this era. He probably was to the 1970s what someone like, say, Hulk Hogan was to the 1980s. His face was plastered on everything from Halloween costumes to posters and stickers, and even a very popular toy, which I'm pretty sure my older brother had at some point. References to Knievel or stand-ins for a Knievel-like performer would become commonplace in films, TV shows, and even various parodies over the years. You can make the argument that he single-handedly became responsible for creating the daredevil stuntman tropes we often see in media today, even years after his death, which happened in 2007 due to cancer. Atari wanted to cash in on the popularity of Knievel by designing an arcade game around his persona and adventures, but maybe they didn't want to pay for the licensing of the official name. It's also possible that rival coin-out company Bally had just simply beat them to the licensing punch, as they developed a pinball machine based around the stuntman in 1976, and it would be released in June of 1977. Now, designing games around copyrighted material or famous personalities was pretty commonplace in the 1960s through even the early 1980s, even if the people involved or the companies didn't give direct permission for their likenesses or copyrighted material to be used. Eventually, though, copyright holders would clamp down on these practices starting in the early 1980s as the industry matured. Stunt Cycle was a successful release for Atari, and though official production numbers do not exist for the game, I would estimate probably around 3,500 to maybe 4,000 Stunt Cycles were made, making it one of the larger hits for Atari in the mid-70s, although nowhere near as successful as Atari's other 1976 hit, Breakout, which would go on to sell over 11,000 copies, or the Atari / Key Games Tank, which is estimated to have sold close to 15,000 copies. During 1976, Atari was also in the process of developing a home video game system, which would become the smash hit Atari Video Computer System, or better known as just the 2600. Many of the more popular Atari arcade games from the Bronze Age made by Atari would be developed into cartridges for the 2600 in time. So it's surprising maybe that Stunt Cycle didn't make it to the 2600. Stunt Cycle was released as a standalone TV game system in 1977, but it was overshadowed by the introduction of cartridge-based video game systems for the home, such as the Atari 2600 or the Fairchild Video System. Standalone gaming systems were on the way out with consumers, which were mostly based on Pong, so the Stunt Cycle system didn't sell very well and it quickly disappeared from store shelves. Despite the lack of interest in the standalone Stunt Cycle system, a 2600 home cartridge version was programmed and completed, but never officially released by Atari. In 1980, Atari decided to try to rework the game theming away from the Stuntman theme into a tie-in with the popular TV show The Dukes of Hazzard. Instead of jumping buses with a motorcycle, players now would jump over a growing lake with the General Lee car seen in the TV show. After this reworking, it was determined by Atari management that the game itself was a bit too old hat compared to the somewhat more sophisticated games in development for the 2600, and a whole new Dukes of Hazzard game was put in development, which also never got released. But this left Stunt Cycle unreleased and until recently, where it was released as a collector or homebrew style release courtesy of the original programmer Bob Polaro. Another interesting tidbit is that a game called Super Stunt Cycle was in development for the Atari 7800 system all the way in 1988, but its real connection to the classic arcade game, other than the title, and that it has a motorcycle in it is pretty unknown to us now. Once the game was finished and released, it was retitled as Motor Psycho in 1990. But the game is really best described as a poor playing copy of Sega's classic game Hang On. Beyond these adaptations, Stunt Cycle sometimes will make appearances in classic arcade game compilations or retro collections. I do think Stunt Cycle is probably one of the earliest games, if not the first game, to depict motocross stunt driving, and maybe even the first game to depict stunt driving in general in a video arcade game. Stunt Cycle inspired a generation of future games around motocross and stunt driving. You could look at games like, say, the BMX section of Epic's California Games and see little hints of Stunt Cycle, or more elaborate stunt driving games such as Atari's arcade release Hard Driving as the evolution of the concepts presented in Stunt Cycle. There's also been numerous official Knievel style games, Knievel games by name and licensed officially for various gaming systems over the years, for platforms such as the Game Boy Color to even popular mobile app games that sport his likeness, his outfit, or his exploits. One last note here is that some historians consider Stunt Cycle to be the first appearance of a black human avatar. When you play as the second player in a two-player game, player 2 is shown as an all-black sprite with the motorcycle and the body all the same color, compared to the first player who's shown as an all-white sprite where his body and his motorcycle is all white. Now, it may not have been the intention of the programmers to show or depict race. They may have just had limited options to show the difference between player 1 and player 2 when dealing with a black and white monitor. But it is a historical footnote that it is technically a black human avatar, and this would have been a first in video games.
All right, so we have found ourselves here in the workshop and in the middle of an Atari coin-op reunion of sorts, and we have our Battle Zone Cabaret size. It's a little dusty because it's been down here for a bit. We are Stunt Cycle, we're going to talk about in a second, and we have our Star Wars upright. Now, the reason I have these three kind of juxtaposed to each other is I want to give you an idea about the size of Stunt Cycle. Now, there's a little bit of a lie going on because Stunt Cycle and Battle Zone are both on these kind of rolly carts that give it about 3.5, 4 more inches, and the Star Wars is not, because the Star Wars is too heavy to be put on one of those carts. So in actuality, Star Wars is like a little bit taller than these. And the Stunt Cycle is kind of in between a Cabaret, a smaller size, and a Star Wars. And it's not as chunky in the back. So I feel like a lot of Bronze Age games are this way up until we get about Space Invader size or some of the other companies' products where they weren't really sure if they wanted them to be small, because the Pong upstairs that we had in another video is actually even a little bit smaller than the Stunt Cycle. It's more of a Cabaret than an upright. And they were still kind of figuring out the dynamics of what a game should be, and the monitor sizes sometimes are a little different. But Stunt Cycle is kind of cool because it's a 19-inch monitor, even though it's black and white, which is kind of the traditional size as we see in the Star Wars, a 19-inch monitor, even though this is vector and black and white, obviously. So let me just kind of pull out the Stunt Cycle because I want to kind of give you an idea of that size a little bit more. So I've backed out a little bit, as you can see, so top to bottom, and you see our Cabaret Battle Zone, which is a pretty darn small game as far as games go. And you see the Stunt Cycle, which is heavy like an upright, but see, it's not super deep as far as depth goes, and it's really not that much taller than a Cabaret, although it is definitely built like an upright. This probably weighs at least 200 pounds plus, as much as most traditional uprights. So we're going to scoot the Battle Zone out of the way and just take a look at Stunt Cycle. We have this kind of, this is probably a Mylar screen, much like Atari did in other games in the future. I don't think this is a silk screen because there's not any of the telltale signs of silk screen. Well, there is a little bit, so this might actually be a silk screen. Side art's pretty good shape, as you can see. A little bit of water dragging damage on the bottom, it's normal. Now the control panel is kind of interesting because on first glance, if you had never played this game, you would think that this controller moves back and forth and up and down like a traditional motorcycle game, almost like Paperboy. But it doesn't. In fact, the only real control you have is you can turn this handlebar controller, and that's it. And that just controls your speed. And then we have the first player, and we have the second player button as well. Again, 19-inch black and white monitor, raster, kind of a neat bezel that kind of mimics a more elaborate playfield than would normally seen. And then the marquee is built into the plastic top bezel, and just a very simplistic coin door. Atari used these probably all the way up until about Asteroids, Lunar Lander, 78 or so, I guess, most of those games. And then you start getting what they call the OWL coin doors, and then the more traditional coin doors that Atari is known for. The control panel is pretty basic. There's no artwork on it. It does have the Atari logo on top of this nice red faux controller here. So let's take a little bit of a deeper look inside. All right, so very exciting. The back door is off of our Stunt Cycle, and you can see here we have our 19-inch black and white monitor, which may look a little strange for those of you who are used to seeing like color raster monitors in arcade games. The layout is very different. It has a little bit of a similarity with some of the black and white vector monitors we've worked on in games like our Battlezone and our Asteroids, where there's a diode involved with what would be considered to be like the flyback. It's not quite a flyback. It's a little bit different on these games. And it's really large capacitors on the left. This game has no less than 3 isolation transformers, which is pretty wild. These monitors are a little squirrely to work with, and this one does need to be recapped, which I haven't done yet. In fact, it's a little dirty here because I haven't really done much of anything since I've gotten it. Onto the bottom, we have just a line filter. We have the safety lockout, which is sideways, and we have our PCB. And the one thing that's interesting about this PCB, I'll just pull this out here, is that this is a later revision. Now there's our ROM. You can see that. But no processor again on this. Nice big cap. The layout of this is very similar to other Bronze Age games. You have almost like these toggle switches that set up the amount of lives and what the extended play becomes. And some of these have a lot of traces, and they were factory traces, but this is a later revision and we don't have any traces. It's a pretty clean board. It works. The only thing it doesn't have is I've noticed some people online, their sound effects have a little like a whistle, like when you complete a jump. Mine doesn't do that. I don't know if something's wrong with it. I haven't quite figured it out. Maybe one of the audio chips is dead, or who knows. But it goes in this little RF cage. That's pretty handy. It probably had a backplate at one point that is just missing. But they were real conscious about interference with these games early on. I think all computer manufacturers in general got a lot of harassment from the FCC for interference, and they kind of went overkill with some of these things, which is why it probably has 3 isolation transformers in this. This is a very thick RF cage compared to most. So that's all there is to it. I mean, there's really not much to the inside of a Stunt Cycle that you can see. I don't know how many are left. If we can estimate, maybe 4,000 of these, maybe a few more. I doubt a whole ton of them are left, just because black and white games are hard to convert to other things. And I think once the color games kind of came around, the golden age came around, a lot of these just kind of got shown the door to the dumpster. And but Stunt Cycle was pretty popular, which is probably why a lot of them have survived compared to some other titles. So a pretty decent sized hit for Atari during that era. So let's play it real quick, and I'll kind of show you the magic of arcade gaming 45 years ago almost. So let's take a look. Now some of this might be a little hard to see because it's dark and I'm trying to get decent contrast with this. But when we first turn it on, there's a little bit of a curl here. You can see, and the first player score always glitches out. It clears up after you play a game. Now these little things, it's hard to see. This is a one-way sticker, and these little tube stickers. They're stickers on top of the monitor since they couldn't quite come up with graphics like that at this point, and you can see like the player 1 and player 2 indicator and the game over. It's just a sticker as well, and then the back lights up in a giant square because that's all they could do at this point. So the purpose of this game is to use your little motorcycle and jump over your buses, and the buses will incrementally get larger, and you have your throttle control, and if you go too fast, you'll crash. Go ahead and start up here. Start with 8 buses. Now if I just yank this thing, it does a wheelie and you slide on your face. And then if I overshoot the buses, I will also crash. So the trick is to just do it just enough and find that sweet spot. And then of course you have one new bus for every time you have a successful jump. And then up to 10 now. Now the way it's set up is that if you clear 23 buses, you get an extended play, and the extended play thing over here will light up, almost like a pinball machine, and let you play again. But at 27 buses, the game ends. Although if you do get the extended play, you can play again, but you can only do it once. Kind of like a pinball machine, I guess, in a way. But this is really it. This is the whole game. Now you can play 2 players, and 2 players kind of more difficult because you can't quite figure out exactly where you had the momentum, because what I'm just doing is incrementally moving up the throttle just ever so much every time a new bus gets added, instead of make sure I clear the jump. So it's just kind of a cheap trick, which I don't know was widely known back when this game was new. Probably not, but thanks to the internet, you can just kind of look it up and see how to play. Now, if you go too short, too, you'll get a fun little doink, and you will also crash. And you only get 3 motorcycles. There's no extra lives or anything. We're getting pretty close here to the extended play. Let's see if I can do it. I think we're going to make it. Look at that extended play. Put that on the old resume. Only 2 more buses. Oh, see, I didn't make it. Too short. Oh well. But I have an extended play, so if we go down here, you can see the buttons lighting up for first player, and I can play again if I want to. But same rules, but you can't do extended play twice. So even if I got 27 buses, it just wouldn't give it to you again. So that's it. I mean, that's just the game. It seems pretty simplistic, but for the era, considering this is only a few years after Pong, you have sprites, you have some pretty interesting dynamic motion, even though we don't have scrolling yet in this game. There's a lot going on with this, considering there is no microprocessor, which just kind of blows me away. Most of this game just operates on flip-flop circuitry, and that's it. So pretty clever, and you can see probably why it was popular. I don't know if this was the first game with a motorcycle. It's definitely the first game with any sort of stunt driving, for sure, but innovative game, maybe not widely known anymore, like a lot of Bronze Age titles, kind of forgotten to the era of time. I think once color took over, people just kind of forgot about a lot of these games, even if they liked them a lot. So that's all I have for you. Stunt Cycle, pretty neat. Really happy to have another Bronze Age game in the collection. It's going to look great next to Pong once we finally have space for it. Whenever that will be. Probably going to be a while. But again, I told myself I wasn't going to buy any more games this year, but I almost made it. Almost made it out of 2022. But this is a really cool one. And I'm pretty sure this is the first video game I ever played as a kid. I can't really, I mean, who's to say, because I would have been like 4 or 5. But I do remember this game as a kid. I remember not really understanding the play dynamics because it was like 4 or 5 years old, so of course I didn't, and video games would have been pretty new at that point. It's a shame that I feel like they never really I guess, tried to reinvigorate this concept. I guess they did a little bit with the hard driving as far as stunt work, but I guess you call it an IP that was kind of left alone and never really explored. Even early on with the Atari 2600, this would have been a great 2600 game. I definitely would have wanted it as a kid if it was out for the 2600. So there you go, Stunt Cycle. Obviously inspired by Evel Knievel. I was surprised Atari did not get sued, but I guess it's close enough away from Evel Knievel not to be sued. So thanks for watching. I have no idea when I'm going to post the next video. Super busy with school and with work, but hope you take care. Always look on my website for new updates. I have a lot of other projects going on as far as writing. There's a book coming out that hopefully I'll have a lot more information on in the next couple of months. So thanks for watching again. Bye.